And so thankfully, our last ligament is going to be our tectorial membrane. If we recall, we had been talking about that posterior longitudinal ligament, okay, and that's going to run posterior to the spinal cord within the spinal column. And we can see where it ends, and it continues as this tectorial membrane. So this will pass through the foramen magnum, and it's going to cover up the alar and transverse ligaments, which makes sense because those were impossible to find. So this sits in front of those, and it's that continuation again of the posterior longitudinal running up the rest of the cervical spine to the foramen magnum. And you have to fade it out because otherwise it's you can kind of poke your hole and see it that way, but it takes a lot of time playing around to find these ligaments. So please take the time to do so. Okay. So that brings us to a far more manageable section of lab, and this is going to be our superficial muscles of the back collection. So these are our extrinsic back muscles, and they're all going to have something to do with the shoulder girdle. So let's start with our trapezius muscle. Okay, our trapezius muscle is going to be divided into three sections. Up high, we have our upper trap. Okay, so this is going to cover the medial part of the superior nuchal line. Okay, so this nuchal line right here on the occipital bone is where it'll originate on the skull. And we can see it's originating medial to all of these cervical vertebrae, but it sits in back. So what ligament sits between the trap and the cervical spine? Oh yes, the ligamentum nuchae, right? It's that extension, that fan-shaped ligament that sits behind the spinous processes of the cervical spine. So that is the connection point going down the cervicals. And then lastly, we have the origin at the C7 vertebrae, the spinous process. And so where this inserts, you have to go all the way to the front here, and we can see it's going to insert at the clavicle or the lateral third. And the function of the upper trap is to elevate the scapula and the shoulder. It'll rotate the head to the opposite side. Okay, so as this muscle constricts, the head will move the opposite way. That we can kind of see that mechanic pretending to pull away from the medial sagittal plane. The head will turn to the opposite side. Okay, so you're contracting the trap that way. And this will also play a role in capital and cervical extension of the head. Okay. So that's our upper trap. In middle, we have our middle trap. And at this point, we're at the thoracic spine. So we can see T1 and T5, those spinous processes is where this muscle originates, as well as the supraspinous ligaments, that posterior ligament that connects all of the spinous processes up and down the spine. And then the insertion for this one is going to be the spine of the scapula. We can see there. And as well as the medial margin of the acromion process, way up here. And we can clearly see that. So the function here is scapular adduction. So it's kind of pulling those scapulas back in kind of a retracting motion because it's pulling towards the middle of the spine. Okay, so you'll get your scapular adduction that way. And then our last section here is going to be our lower trap. This is originating from T6 to T12, those spinous processes and supraspinous ligaments. And we follow it laterally and see that it inserts as well into the spine of the scapula. And so the function here is going to be, again, scapular adduction, bringing the scapulas together, as well as a depression and the upward rotation of the scapula. That's kind of hard to visualize, but imagine the scapula here on the screen is turning upwards. Okay, so it's kind of extending back, and it's also adducting or retracting to the medial sagittal plane. And so the innervation for this muscle is going to come from the spinal accessory nerve, which is cranial nerve 11. And then as well as spinal nerves C3 to C4, which will take care of the lower part of the trapezius. So that's our complicated trap.